Did you grow up in a time when your parents checked your Halloween candy? Were your parents afraid of razor blades or poison? Did you get annoyed because you had to wait for your candy to get x-rayed? Did you think they were overreacting? Was it just an urban legend passed down by helicopter parents? Your parents were most likely upset about the incident on Halloween in 1974. The story I'm about to tell you is about the man who killed Halloween, later dubbed the Candyman. Ronald O'Bryan lived in the Deer Park in Pasadena, Texas. He worked as an optician. His most recent position was with Texas State Optical in Sharpston, Houston, Texas. Obryan was a member of the Second Baptist Church in Deer Park, Texas. He served as a deacon and sang in the church choir. He was also in charge of the bus program. Halloween 1974 was a rainy, dismal evening. However, the weather did not deter the children from wanting to go out and collect candy. Ronald usually had no interest in taking the children out trick-or-treating. This Halloween, he was excited about it. Ronald planned to go trick-or-treating with his son Timothy, 8, and daughter Elizabeth, 5, this Halloween. Joining them were a close friend, Jim Bates, and his 2 children, Mark and Kimberly. Obryan lived in a Deer Park townhouse. He made plans with the Bates' father, Jim, to escort the children to his more affluent Pasadena neighborhood weeks earlier. They arrived at a darkened house. The children hurried to the door to knock. They went on to the next home because no one answered. O'Bryan remained behind and reappeared moments later with a handful of giant pixie sticks. He came out and said, "You have wealthy neighbors. Look at what they're handing out." Ronald handed each child a pixie stick. Laughing, he said, he would eat the last one himself. They later returned to the Bates residence. Jim Bates still had a large number of trick-or-treaters at his door. Ronald asks, holding up the last pixie stick, "Who wants the last one?" Whitney Parker, an 11-year-old boy from nearby, piqued O'Bryan's interest by raising his hand and reminding him that they both attended Pasadena's Second Baptist Church. The child dashed to the next house carrying the massive pixie stick. The O'Bryan family said goodnight to the Bates family and returned home, all except Ronald's wife, Denise, who decided to visit a friend before returning home. Back at the O'Bryan house, the children were excited to rummage through their candy bags. Ronald informed them that it was too late for sugar. They could each choose only one piece of candy. Timothy was having difficulty opening the pixie stick. He discovered that it was stapled shut. The child struggled to get the powdered sugar out of the paper tube and into his mouth. His father rolled it around in his hands to loosen it up. It appeared to be effective. Timothy described the powdered sugar candy as bitter after tasting it. Ronald poured him a glass of Kool-Aid to help wash it down. Timothy began complaining of stomach pain. The little boy hurried to the bathroom, where he vomited and convulsed on the floor. Ronald claims he ran into the bathroom to hold Timothy while he was sick. Timothy soon went limp in his arms. He called an ambulance, but Timothy died on the way to the hospital less than an hour after eating the candy. The police officer questioned Ronald about where he had taken the children trick-or-treating. The officer wanted to follow his path and interview all the homeowners. None of the other children had become ill that night, so the police had few leads. Fortunately, the other children did not consume the candy. Whitney Parker was cutting open his pixie sticks on the kitchen drain board. His father told him it was time for bed. Mark Bates did not eat his candy, he was discovered sleeping with the candy still clutched in his hand. The child struggled to open the staple. David Malone, a Deer Park ambulance attendant, was prepared to give Tim Obryan mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Doctors later told Malone that the boy still had enough cyanide in his mouth to kill anyone who attempted to save his life. Parents across the country were outraged, and Obryan, who is deeply religious, won the sympathy of millions by singing a moving solo at his church after the funeral. He was all boy, said Obryan. He was into football, basketball, and anything else. He never encountered a stranger. However, I have peace of mind knowing Tim is now in heaven. An autopsy confirmed the medical examiner's suspicions. Timothy had consumed enough cyanide to kill 2 people. According to a pathologist, tests later revealed the poison had been packed into the top 2 inches of the pixie sticks. The police officers returned Ronald to the neighborhood where the group had been trick-or-treating so he could direct them to the house where he had obtained the pixie sticks. But he could not find the home and claimed he had never seen the face of the person responsible, who had just emerged from the doorway and handed him candy. Investigators became suspicious. A few days passed, and the investigators took Ronald out again. As a result of the strategy, Ronald's memory was jogged. He directed them toward the house. The homeowner, Courtney Melvin, was an air traffic controller and had been at work until 11 p.m. that night. He worked at Houston's William Hobby P. Airport. There was no way he could have handed over the poisoned sweets. Earlier in the evening, Melvin's wife and their child ran out of candy. They switched off all the lights. The more police talked to residents in the area, the more suspicious things became apparent. No one had given out pixie sticks for Halloween, and O'Bryan and Bates children had only gone to a few houses because it had begun to rain. Jim Bates also told police how strange Ronald started acting that night, even saying Ronald leaped over the coffee table to prevent one of the Bates children from eating their pixie sticks when they returned home. A few days after Timothy was buried, police received a phone call from an insurance agent. He reported some unusual activity. Ronald, unbeknownst to his wife, had purchased substantial life insurance policies for his 2 children. He purchased a $10,000 policy for each of his children in January. Then shortly before Timothy's death, he purchased an additional $20,000 policy for each of his children. Days before Halloween and Timothy's death, Ronald took out another $20,000 policy on each child, bringing the total to $60,000 for each child. When police looked into it further, they discovered Ronald was deeply in debt. He was in debt of around $100,000. In today's money, that is slightly more than $300,000. He had trouble keeping a job for an extended time and was about to be fired from Texas State Optical for suspicion of theft. Their family home had recently been foreclosed on, and his car was about to be repossessed. Ronald was clearly in over his head and needed money. The morning after Timothy's death, he called his insurance company to inquire about collecting the policies he had taken out on his son. Ronald also showed a keen interest in learning more about poison in the weeks preceding Halloween. One of his co-workers was a chemist, so he began asking him about potassium cyanide and where he could get some. He went to a local chemical company store to buy some, but he came away empty-handed when he discovered he could not buy them in small quantities. It is unknown where or when Ronald obtained the smaller amount of cyanide. He obtained it, according to police, shortly before Halloween. On November the 5th, 1974, police arrived at the O'Bryan home with an arrest warrant for Ronald for 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder for the other children. He denied everything and pleaded not guilty when interrogated. The evidence was overwhelming. In a search of the O'Bryan family home, police found Ronald's pocket knife with traces of plastic and pixie powdered candy stuck to the blade. It is likely what he used to contaminate the candy tubes. Besides the physical evidence, there was damning testimony. The chemist and several others claimed he took an unusual interest in cyanide in the weeks leading up to Halloween. Timothy's mother also spoke in court. Ronald claimed that Timothy was the one who chose the pixie stick as the one candy he could have that evening. She rejected this claim, saying that Ronald practically forced him to eat the pixie stick. Several co-workers testified as well. Ronald informed them that he would be leaving his job soon due to receiving a large sum of money. He also told Jim Bates that he would be buying a house soon and asked him not to tell his wife. He informed everyone that he would receive a large sum of money at the start of the year. On June 3, 1975, the jury took 45 minutes to find Ronald guilty and 70 minutes to sentence him to death. He attempted to appeal his conviction several times, but it was rejected. His wife divorced him because she suspected him of murdering their son for money. She later remarried. Deneen's daughter, Elizabeth, was adopted by her new husband. On March the 31st, 1984, almost 10 years after murdering his 8-year-old son by cyanide poisoning, Ronald was put to death by lethal injection, which is a far less painful death than his son would have suffered. Protesters gathered outside the prison on the day he died. At the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, a crowd of around 300 gathered to hear if the Halloween poisoner had met his end, shouting "Trick or treat" and throwing candy at anti-penalty protesters. Ronald was the first inmate in Texas to be executed following the reinstatement of the death penalty. In prison, Ronald was not well received. This is where he got the nickname Candyman. His final words were, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death." Do you believe Ronald attempted to poison the neighbor's children to bolster his claim that the candy was poisoned by a stranger? Or was Ronald simply evil? Perhaps you can see why your parents were so protective of you on Halloween. You now know where the story came from. Perhaps this Halloween you should inspect your child's candy more closely. Remember, there's always copycat criminals. Let's talk about it in the comments.